Welcome. Scott here. Here is a quick boss guide for the upcoming Heretics event, Dragon Seated in Heaven's Heretics. The event synergy units are Balthier, Golbez, Rem and Rinoa. Both Balthier and Golbez are getting their C90 awakenings and reworks. Balthier FR will also be making its debut. All event characters will be getting their force enhancements. We will be fighting 2 Celestial which has 90 million HP each. They are immune to all forms of debuffs. They are weak against Dark Elemental and ranged attacks. The turn requirement is 70. The HP requirements is 8000. Before I continue further, here is a small disclaimer clause for the video. The guide is written based on the time that the event was released for the Japanese version. Please do note that it is possible that the boss fight mechanics might differ when the actual event is released in global. Like most other Shinryu fights, the boss gains increased brave damage and gain resistances at start of the fight and 49% HP threshold. Bringing a support like Lunafreya, Charlotta, Aerith, Garnet, Ramza, etc. that boost your attack with their auras will help to make your fight easier. As the boss gains substantial boost to their defenses with the auras, it is important to complement your party with attack auras so you can handle the increased defense stats boost for this fight. This fight features a lot of framed buffs and the boss can gain and fill up its 8 buff slots with buffs if you are not careful. Fortunately, the fight is still relatively easy as long as you have the means to handle. For buff negation, you can use either Aerith or Yuffie. Vincent also has buff negation with his BT aura. For dispellers, I have listed down all the dispellers that are currently available in the fight. You can also make your own dispeller with the vanilla RF spheres, that is provided that unit has E-sphere slot. Units that can constantly unbreak and rebreak with E-sphere slots will be benefit a lot from this. Examples are Vayne, Noelle, Arthen, Orin and Arania. As the bosses are immune to debuffs, you probably want to bring dispeller that doesn't rely on the debuffs. Examples of such dispellers are Balthier, Cloud, Cid, Lion, Cyan, Cid Reigns and Jelcat. Other dispellers with debuff mechanics are Yuffie, Vanille, Pain, Arcela, Ferris, Seymour, and Beatrix. Since you can't weaken the bosses with debuffs, you will want to reduce their brave gains. Examples of brave gain negation that doesn't rely on debuffs are Golbez and Sephiroth BT aura. The boss can inflict a HP poison debuff with its force ability. You might want to consider either bringing Aerith, Lena, Aphma for debuff negation or deploy debuff cleansers like Yuna and Pernello. The bosses also have warp mechanics, so make sure you have means to counter them. I will cover on them later. If you have her fully geared, Rinoa can solo this fight as well. As we are no longer have Lufania plus fights, the boss guide will be focused primarily on Shinryu fights. In Shinryu, you need to understand the effects gained by the boss as the force gauge build up, its force ability and its force time effect. As your party has low force levels, it is highly certain that the boss force gauge will build up faster than yours. To have a better understanding on the basics of the force gauge mechanics and Shinryu fights, I have done a video explaining the mechanics. I have included the link to the video under the comments and video description for your quick reference. For this fight, the boss force gauge is broken into 4 thresholds. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 20%, the boss's trigger granted buffs where it will gain an 8-turn HP damage up plus 50% framed buff. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 40%, the boss's trigger granted buffs where it will gain an 8-turn post-turn Brave Regan framed buff. The post-turn Brave Regan scales off the boss max Brave. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 60%, the boss's trigger granted buffs where it will gain an 8-turn 999% Brave damage resist framed buff. In other words, your party Brave hits will deal 0 Brave damage unless you dispel the buff. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 80%, the bosses trigger granted buffs where it will gain an 8-turn 9999% HP damage resist framed buff. In other words, your party won't deal HP damage unless you dispel the buff. The boss force gauge will build up faster as its HP is lowered. You can refer to the table on the screen for the percentages. At the 100% threshold, the Celestial will use its force ability, Poison Mist Plus, and activates its force time for 5 turns. The boss force ability, Poison Mist Plus, will result the boss dispel the left-handmost buff of your party, grants itself a 3-turn rate up plus 30% framed buff while trigger a guaranteed hit AoE Brave plus HP that inflicts Poison Mist framed debuff on all targets for 5 turns. Poison Mist inflicts HP poison that scales off the 100% of the boss' current attack stats. Upon using the force ability, the boss will enter into its force time where the gauge will start to emit a red hue with a counter of 5 on its gauge. When the force time is activated, the bosses will start to use Massive Strike Plus during its turn. Massive Strike Plus is a single target Brave plus HP attack that grant the boss a 5-turn damage taken down framed buff that incorporates 30% Brave and HP damage reductions. To freeze the enemy's force time effects, you need to use a force ability that deal ranged damage. Other than Balthier, you can consider using Kain, Lyud, or Tidus. Now let's go through the fight key mechanics. The boss turns will become instantaneous at the following HP thresholds: 79%, 39%, and 19%. Upon triggering, the boss will warp its turn forward and gain 2 additional turns and grant itself a shield buff that equates to 10 times the boss' current initial Brave stats. The shield buff will only negate Brave damage and become stronger as the battle progress. Paired with the post-turn Brave Regen when the boss force gauge is at 40% and above, the shield will become very problematic to handle if you don't have the tools to handle and doing a hit and counter run. Like most Shinryu bosses, the Celestial have a standard moves rotation cycle. It will start off with Massive Strike, a single target Brave attack that grants the boss 2 non-framed buffs for 3 turns, raises its initial Brave up plus 30% and Brave Regen buff that scales off 30% of the boss initial Brave. Make sure you dispel the initial Brave buff before the boss trigger the shields. Next, it will use Holy Breath, an AoE Holy Elemental Brave attack. It will grant itself 3 turn speed plus 30% non-framed buff. Lastly, it will use Saint Spear. The variant of the Saint Spear seems to be dependent on the number of the buffs that the bosses have. It will use Saint Spear, a single target Brave plus HP attack if it has 6 or more buffs. Do note that the Brave potencies are 3 times off its normal Brave attack. It will use Saint Spear plus, a single target Brave plus HP attack and grants itself 3 turn attack up plus 50% non-framed buff if it has less than 6 buffs. Here are some combat tips from me regards to the fight. If you are doing the fight without a designated dispeller, it is important to save your dispel skills when you need to do dispel. The boss will only start to gain extraordinary resistance when the force gauge is above 60% and 80%. To handle the 60% force gauge threshold or the Brave damage resistances, without using any dispelling utility, you can make use Brave gains or Brave gains off HP attacks. You can make use of Rainbow Auras or Brave cap damage if you are bringing Setzer. Units like Kate Sith, Snow, and Charlotta offers Brave gains with their special mechanics. Just save your dispel utility when the boss force gauge meter reaches 80%. Alternatively, you can target to finish nuking the boss before its force gauge ever reaches 60%. You can speed up your force gauge filling by bringing a force gauge charger. We have come to the last part of the guide. Recommended FR units for this fight are Balthier, Tidus, Lyud and Kain. You can also consider using the recent FR units Aerith, Tifa, or Rinoa. Break immunity support characters like Kor or Ursula is also highly recommended to use here. Balthier can steal all the boss buffs and use them for his own benefits. He can achieve immortality for this fight as long as you steal those juicy Brave damage resist, HP damage resist and damage taken down buffs. To speed up your force gauge filling, you can bring force chargers like Pernello, Ignis, Aerith, Braska, Charlotta, or Lunafreya. Selphie is a good force gauge filler, but she will be pretty limited since the bosses are immune to debuffs. Depending on your party setup, you can bring tanks that offer damage mitigation support and follow up attackers' units. Cover tanks like Gladio, Auron, and Golov is very valuable here. Gladio is immune to breaks and HP damage as long as his blink buff is up. Auron will serve even better if you have equipped him with a Vanille Sphere so that he can also dispel a buff whenever he counters. As almost all of the boss attacks are non-guaranteed hit, you can use evasion tanks like Golov, Edge, or Leela. Edge won't be unable to apply his lock, but he will serve well once you got his EX buff up. Leela will nullify all danger for this fight if you have her. However, you need to compensate for her weak damage output. Golbez, the other featured C90 unit, also get a nice rework. His BT aura will negate Brave gains, which is particularly useful to counter the boss post-turn Brave Regen mechanic. He will also be hitting for Dark Elemental weakness since the boss are weak to Dark by default. Before I end the guide, let's cover a bit on the featured FR unit. Balthier FR is very niche and situational. His FR strengths will depend on how buff heavy the fight will be. Don't be surprised that this FR can reach 999%. Upon using it, the FR will cleanse all debuffs for the party and steal 3 buffs from all targets and extend the stolen buffs by 1 turn for Balthier himself. Let's cover a bit on the FR conditions. You will get a massive 80% HP damage bonus uptick whenever you dispel a boss buff. This uptick applies to off-turn dispel as well. An example is Auron countering and dispel the boss buff with Vanille Sphere equipped. You will get a generic 20% HP damage bonus uptick whenever you use a ranged ability. You will get a 40% HP damage bonus uptick when you attack an enemy who has no buffs. Just bring him with a party of ranged attackers. You can make use counter unit with buff dispel off counters by using a counter tank like Auron with Vanille Sphere. Units with E-Sphere slot that can break and re-break works very well with that spear. This FR still works well even the boss doesn't have any buffs and favor a ranged oriented team composition. A 60% HP damage bonus uptick per turn is still great here. With this, I have come to the end of my boss guide presentation. Hopefully you find it useful. If you like the video, please give a like. Please subscribe to my channel for future gaming content. Good luck for the fight in the coming days. Bye.